Singapore branch. First of all, a few housekeeping rules. If you can all make sure that you're on mute throughout the presentation, what we can do is we can field questions. You can put the questions in the comments and there'll be an opportunity to ask our speaker any questions that we have at the end of the session. There may be some interaction between Sushil, and he may ask some questions. So we've got myself and JC. Obviously, JC is an ExCo member as well, and we'll make sure that we take note of those questions and those interactions and keep everyone moving forward. I want to thank Catherine Daly, who's also here tonight representing IOSH from the UK. So let's get on without further ado. Again, thanks, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. And it's my pleasure to introduce Sushil Pardhan, who is the COO of MitCat Advisory. Sushil is a seasoned risk management professional with over 30 years industry and leadership experience in management roles. He's worked across complex operations, supervising diverse teams and managing significant challenges and risk programs from India to global businesses. Sushil is a proven custom risk management solution advocate with businesses from India, Myanmar, Iraq, Bangladesh, China, Japan, Sri Lanka, and difficult geographical areas within India as well. Sushil is a prolific speaker in several industries. He has spoken in London, Dubai, New York, Singapore, and Beijing, to name a few. He's been a keynote speaker and a moderator for industry panels and discussions, specifically on his topic of risk management and security in high-risk environments and areas. Sushil had 22 years in the military. He retired as a lieutenant colonel from the Indian Army. He had a number of decorations from counterterrorism operations. He trained in the Indian Commandos, and he was also a UN peacekeeper and was awarded the UN Peacekeepers Medal, I believe, the UN medal. He's conducted countless training sessions across the globe, crisis management, simulation exercises, command center operations, risk management, intelligence, and information security. Can you all please give Sushil a very big, warm virtual welcome? Sushil, if you would like to take over, share your slides, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you so much, Andy, for the very generous introduction, and a good day to all of you. And thank you for joining in from so many countries. It's really wonderful to be a part of this session. And well, I do tend to speak a bit fast sometimes when I'm excited, and you have my typical Indian accent. So if any of you feel I'm going too fast and I'm not very clear or not very audible, just somebody ask me to slow down a bit and I shall do so. And I'm going to kick off immediately with a bit of a presentation that I've created for all of you. A couple of disclaimers. Firstly, I am going to talk about a few case studies of crisis management and crisis in general. These come from different countries and from different geographies, and also relate to some global corporations. So I have no complaint with any of them. These are open source case studies, and I have picked them up only for the good and the bad examples that help me to amplify what I'm going to talk about. Second disclaimer is that I'm really aware that a lot of you are experienced occupational safety and health experts. So I don't claim too much of expertise in that sector. Yes, what I do have a lot of experience in is crisis management and training people for crisis management by awareness sessions and crisis simulation. So that's what I'm trying to bring to the table. So please do excuse me if I get some of my technical fault issues or technical aspects incorrect somewhere, and I apologize in advance for that. So having said that, I'm going to show my slides, and do let me know by checking if my slides are visible. So let me use the share screen option. And there I am. And, so are my slides visible? Someone? Andy?
Yes.
Yeah, we can see those, Shashil. Thank you.
Great. So there you see the topic, crisis and disaster management, enabler or safety net for OSH. And there you have my name and my designation, the way Andy announced me. So guys, those of you who want to reach out on LinkedIn or any other social media, I'm available, and I'm usually more communicative on LinkedIn. So see you there sometime. And with that, I will move to the next slide. So again, I want to check the slide transition. So are you able to see the next slide?
So Sheil, I think you moved to the slide view. So can you put it on full screen view?
Ah, okay.
I think you need
Sorry.
to interchange the views. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Just a minute. Okay.
Yeah,
is it visible now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, great. So what we are going to talk about, or what I'm going to talk about, is three things. One is understanding what is a crisis. Then how to prepare for a crisis. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because there are multiple ways, and different organizations have different ways of managing or dealing with impending crisis. And last but not the least, some issues on managing a crisis. Now I'm going to talk about, when we talk about preparing and managing a crisis, I'm also going to take on some case studies like I mentioned. So first of all, let's start by trying to understand what is a crisis. I'm sorry. Have I gone back into the non-slideshow mode? Yeah. Okay. So a crisis in general is a critical occurrence that leads to an unacceptable loss of life, has some serious financial impact, has reputational loss on the company, or any other serious impact on the organization. And it also invites negative external scrutiny by way of media, social media, legal issues, regulators, government agencies, and auditors. So this is something that we must remember as we talk through the next hour, that anything that leads to these five things, and a cumulative effect of all five of them, is what is a crisis. So is this a crisis? Anyone? Please put it on the chat box if you think this is a crisis. Okay, someone says depends. Someone says yes. Someone says yes. Disaster. Okay, disaster depends. For me, yes. Okay, great. That's a good way of qualifying it. Yes, yes, yes. Crisis for some, very right. My boss would kill me. Thanks, Darren. Okay, great. Thank you guys for the response. It shows that all of you are at least listening to me. Claire says personal disaster, but unlikely to be a company disaster. Depends on what is the issue and what laptop is it, whom does it belong to, and what is the content on that. And Claire, if you go by what Darren says, my boss would kill me, then definitely it's likely to be a company disaster. So why I am showing you this is because a crisis always has to be contextualized. What may be a crisis for some may be just a small event or an incident for some, and what may be a minor incident for some would be a crisis for some. For example, okay, so if you are in the, let's say, in the manufacturing industry, and you are, or your company or your manufacturing plant is hit by a 3-day power shortage where most of your machinery depends on power, and you have only enough generating capability in-house by way of diesel generators or whatever for just 24 hours. So is this a crisis for you? I'm sure it is. But if you are in a software industry or a BPO or a IT enabled services, and you have a 3-day outage, but you have additional backup by way of moving to another location or shifting your work to another city where there's no power outage. So for your let's say for your organization, this may not be a crisis. It may be an incident which needs to be handled quickly. It may be a disruption to your business continuity, which needs to be sorted out in a few hours' time. But definitely it's not something unsurmountable, which would lead to serious loss of business, or definitely would not lead to loss of life or any accidents, whereas the same story may not be there across different industries. So that's why it's important to say and understand that what is a crisis for you is the first step to understand. Now, I'm just going to talk about two things which are very commonly talked about, and these are the issues, or these are the environments within our operating world, which are used to define some of the conditions there. So I'm sure all of you have heard of VUCA, the VUCA world. So those of you who have, quickly, please type it into the chat box. What do you think VUCA stands for? Someone?
Sorry, I was trying to type, but is it?
Yes, I got
Polarity, uncertainty, complex, and ambiguity.
Absolutely, that's what JC has typed in, and yeah. So I will talk a little bit about these things, and now coming to the more current context, have any of you heard about something known as the BANI world? BANI. If you have, just say yes. I don't expect you to know what BANI stands for, or if you do, please type that in as well. If you haven't heard of it, say no. It's new, great, okay. Not aware. No, Vincent says no as well. Not aware. Okay, good. So I am happy that I have something new to talk about. Nope, okay. Heard about it, but don't remember. JC, good, thanks. Yes. So these are not something, this is not something that, there are multiple acronyms which talk about current world conditions. And, there was, when people have said, and Andy said as well, that VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. So these are conditions which describe the world around us. And to that, somebody converted it into an acronym to call it Vulcan, where they added L to say lunatic. So when lunatic is, again, like I said, no disrespect to any individual or to any organization. So some of the decisions which were taken by, let's say, Trump, or the decision to invade Ukraine by Russia, generally people say, okay, that's a lunatic decision because that came out of nowhere, led to a lot of disastrous issues along the way. And the second, the additional letter which was added to this acronym was N, where N stood for no return. So that was very strange again, because a lot of things have happened which, let's say, for example, I'm going to talk a lot of examples coming out from the COVID-19 pandemic. So some of the issues that came out from the pandemic, like logistics and supply chain restructuring, have gone to the stage of no return, where a serious change or a serious crisis led to a complete change of business model for some of the businesses, where it went to a no return stage. So this was VUCA modified to talk about Vulcan. And now in today's world, people are talking about something known as the BANI world, right? So yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Vincent, you're right. That is, and that is why it's not adopted so not adopted so widely, because people think that somebody just made up an acronym. But yes, the factors that combine into that are quite true. So this is what we'll talk about, and this is what sometimes can lead to crisis. So I'm again trying to correlate these acronyms and these descriptions to situations of crisis. So BANI, as is on the screen, if you can see, stands for brittle, anxious, non-linear, and incomprehensible. Now I'll just try and explain these very briefly. So when you say brittle, it means that on the surface of it, everything looks good. on the surface of it or on appearances, things look good to be going, but underneath the surface, things are very fragile and may lead to a sudden collapse of the system. So a typical case in point was the power situation in Germany, where it looked as if, okay, they had things within control. A couple of years back, they announced that we are not going to go back to we are not going to restart our nuclear reactors because we are moving to green energy, and we have enough multiple kinds of resources to handle our power requirements. And suddenly the cutting off of, or the partial cutting off of gas and the disruption of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia led to a huge power crisis, inflation, and other issues in Germany. So on the surface of it, it looked great. Okay, we got gas, we got green energy, we are going to do away with nuclear energy. And now they've taken a decision that, okay, we may not start new nuclear reactors, but we are going to stop the process of decommissioning our existing nuclear reactors, and they're going to continue generating power at least for another year. There are some timelines to it, but I'm not sure of the exact dates. The second part is anxious, where because of the uncertainty, people are always trying to understand what's happening and not able to connect the dots together. This is also due to a huge amount of information overload, also contributed to by fake news, and also contributed to by biased media reporting. There are a lot of things which keep coming in, and for an ordinary, let's say, person operating within a system, within an organization, sometimes it becomes very difficult to make sense of what's happening around you, whether it's at a global level, whether it's a regional level, whether it's an organizational level, or just what's happening to humanity. And to a lot of people, that leads to anxiousness. And this translates into a lack of decision making, that I don't know what's happening about aspect A. So how should I prepare for it? Or should I not prepare for it because I prepare for aspect A and suddenly aspect B may hit me. So as a result, then I will go completely off track. So let's see how things come along, and I will deal with it as it comes. The third aspect is non-linear, where one small thing or one issue can become completely multiplicative in its effect. And here I'm going to talk about the pandemic, because everyone thought that things will be restricted when initially it started off in China, started off in some parts of Southeast Asia, in some parts of US, some parts of Europe. People thought, okay, it's tough, but it's going to be contained, it's going to be managed. And then suddenly it blew out of proportion, became non-linear, started, instead of progressing by arithmetic progression, the infections, the deaths grew in a geometric progression. And that is why we call it non-linear. And this is typical of many things. So another example here would be the supply chain disruptions. Everyone thought, that, okay, right, there are some issues, there are some sanctions due to transshipment of goods from China or some other parts of China. And then what happened is that it became a snowballing effect, where containers filled with goods were stacked up in ports because of the COVID-induced lockdowns in various countries. There were no workmen or there was no machinery being operated to unload those containers. As a result, no empty containers were going back, also because there were shipping embargoes. So no empty containers going back, full containers piled up at certain ports. So there was a complete disruption in supply chain of certain goods. And what was alarming at that time was the disruption of supply chain of food products, because people were going hungry in some parts of the world where they were dependent on certain imports. And the same thing, if you see, happened about a couple of months back, where there was a serious issue of disruption of the production and the transshipment of wheat from Russia and Ukraine to some other parts of the world, which were heavily dependent on this wheat, like Egypt or some parts of North Africa. So that is non-linear. And the last is incomprehensible. Now, incomprehensible is difficult to understand. So again, incomprehensibility in its turn leads to anxiousness. Incomprehensible would be because of too much data, lots of false data points, and too much information which is being pushed into specific direction by vested interests. So as a result, for an ordinary person or for an organization, they are not able to predict the trends. They are not able to join the dots, something which will help them to plan their business operations. And then this obviously leads to anxiousness. So now, very quickly, just a couple of things. How do we deal with this? There are just 4 points which I want to pick up for the Bani world environment. And those are, yeah. So brittleness requires capacity and resilience. So when we talked about supply chain fragility, here now what people are talking of in supply chains is, we've heard of these terminologies. I'm just going to quickly repeat them. One is from offshoring, where in a global world, you could do business in one part of the world by sourcing material from another part of the world, getting labor from another part of the world, putting it together in a third place, and then selling it to a fourth market. So now that supply chain offshoring, to some extent, some countries are going back to reshoring, that because of global implications of catastrophes, my business and my supply chains may be affected. Let me get some of this back to my own home or to my home region. Then you have something known as reshoring, where nearshoring, where instead of, let's say, US sourcing their manufacturing of garments from Vietnam or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, decides that, okay, these are too far for my supply chains to be reliable because of issues like the pandemic. So let me source them closer to home, like in Mexico or Venezuela or some other things like that. So, and the third point is friendshoring, where because of sanctions, one in the case of against China during the pandemic, second is during Russia, the current situation where there are sanctions on Russia and its satellites. So instead of putting your supply chains into a region which may be affected by sanctions, you shift them to a friendly country. When I say friendly, it means ideologically friendly, it means ethnically or people friendly, or it could mean market friendly. So that's the kind of things which where we build up our capacity and resilience. And this is, I'm just giving an example of supply chains. Now, anxiety requires empathy and mindfulness. So here again, the typical case would be anxiousness about jobs. With all this downsizing happening in certain industries, people are anxious about, will I have my job tomorrow? Some companies are saying, if you don't come back to the workplace, you're not going to be holding on to your job any longer. So this is for organizations where if they don't want to have a crisis which comes out of a sudden lack of people who leave and go, and this is in the news. So you must have heard of companies which end up having problems. Sorry, my fault. I need to go back to the previous slide. Yeah, this is where, you need to have empathy, mindfulness, try and adopt to the new requirements of the workplace, which has now evolved over a period of time. Yes, of course, we do understand that certain jobs need hands-on, cannot be done remotely, but there are some jobs which can be done not necessarily from home, but a place closer to home, for example. So those are the kind of things that companies need to now think of. And non-linearity calls for context and adaptivity. So when we said non-linearity means something which can suddenly expand in a geometric manner or in an explosive manner. For that, you need to identify that, okay, this is an issue which is coming up, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. This is an issue which is likely to come up. So I already need to start adapting my organization to cater for this potential disruption. And if you don't do so, if you're not thinking ahead, then you are likely to be hit by a non-linear crisis. And the last but not the least is incomprehensibility. We said that this is out of issues of too much data, too much information, false news, fake news, misinformation, disinformation. Some of it is deliberate, some of it is commercially motivated, some of it is politically and ideologically motivated. So how do you figure out what is all of this is? So one, and also this translates down to your organization, because suddenly when you realize let's say you belong to a company X, and media is talking about how, or media, social media is talking about, oh, how company X discriminates against this kind of person, and oh, how company X is doing this. These kind of operations in so many countries which are against the environment, or how company X is doing something unethical in a particular country. And then suddenly, if you belong to company X and you start thinking that, oh, is this the company that I want to be working for? Is this the organization that I want to be associated for? And good, capable people, due to overload of information, overload of false information, start having doubts. So what must organizations do? The moment such things come out, they should be very transparent, and they should use trend analysis to try and figure out. I know it's still in the making. It's not something which is defined very clearly as of now, but using artificial intelligence to decipher the information, to analyze trends, to try and be more predictive in what's happening, and then communicate that information within the organization. I know in the last 5 minutes or 7 minutes, I have talked about a lot of very abstract concepts, but I just wanted you to be aware of these for the simple reason that these are some of the contributors to crisis in times to come. I hope I'm okay with that. Anyone who feels differently or who agrees with me, just say a yes in the chat box quickly. Or anybody who disagrees, please say, stop talking nonsense. Anybody? Yeses, chat box? Or no's? Come on, folks. There are almost 60 of us. A couple of responses will at least tell me that somebody is listening, if not liking. Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks. That's nice. I can hear that. I can see that. Thank you so much, guys. Great. Thanks for all the responses. Okay, so you don't have to necessarily agree with me, but I'm pleased that all those who have typed responses do agree with me. Moving on to the next aspect. What does this indicate? Quickly, please type on the chat box. This is not new to you guys. Come on. So I'm sure you've all heard of this. Perfect. I have one answer already. Yep. That's it. Yes. So definitely this is something that we talk about very frequently in public domain today, and that is a black swan event. A black swan event. Okay, Javed says duck. Yes, it does look like a duck. So I don't contribute. I don't make the diagram. I just picked it off the net. So sorry if it doesn't look too much like a swan, but it's supposed to be a black swan. So guys, what is a black swan? Can somebody quickly type out one liner? What is a black swan? I know all of you are experienced professionals, so I expect a quick response. Okay, an unusual event, outlier, perfectly right, Vincent. Nurul says the making of an ugly duckling. Okay. Okay, yes, to metaphorically, yes, you're right, Nurul. And Alan says unexpected event seemingly coming out of nowhere. Perfectly right. So a non-predictable event. Absolutely. So, you know, there are multiple definitions of a black swan event, and I just put a compilation of some of these things which I have put together. So what is a black swan? A black swan is an unpredictable event, like someone already said on the chat box, that is beyond what is normally expected of a situation. And what is more important, not just the unpredictability. What is important is that it has to have a severe consequence or severe impact. Then only it is noteworthy and worth calling a black swan. And what is characteristic of a black swan event is that it's very rare, has severe impact, and when you think about it in hindsight, you realize that yes, we should have seen this coming. Yes, Darren is also right. Black swan is an opportunity. And to that, at the end, I'm not going to talk about a crisis as an opportunity, but definitely our understanding of crisis today is that what is harmful to an organization, to one organization, is a great opportunity for another organization to grow in. Now, have you heard the other term which leads to a crisis, which is called a gray rhino? So those of you who have heard this term, please put it on the chat box. And I'm not using these words because I love jargon. I'm using these words because they are in common domain. Everyone talks about them. So it's easy for everyone to relate and understand them. That's why I'm talking these terms. Crisis managers tend to talk very technical stuff at some time, but I'm just trying to keep it as simple as possible. A gray rhino. I'm waiting for answers on the chat box. Very right. Vincent says predictable, but not addressed. Okay. Yeah, someone else. Highly probable, but neglected. Yes, very right. Jaka Anugrah. Yeah, anyone else? Okay, so why are some crises come out of black swan? So when we say a crisis has been caused by a black swan, because it came out of the blue, we did not expect something like this to happen. We did not see something like this coming. Would any of you qualify the COVID-19 pandemic as a black swan? Or let me put it the other way around. Everyone says it's a black swan. Would any of you say that it was not a black swan? Please put it on the chat box because I know you're muted. Yeah, black swan, maybe running out of, okay, right. Okay, great. So, okay, great. So somebody says that it's not necessarily a black swan because it started spreading slowly and others should have seen it coming. Now we have something known as a gray rhino. So which somebody said that it's a highly probable but a neglected threat which could have enormous impact. And why it is called a gray rhino is because when you see a rhino running towards you, it's a huge beast, a dangerous beast, which is armor protected by thick skin, which has tremendous momentum, has a dangerous horn, which can hurt you, has just the sheer momentum of its impact with you can hurt you. You can see it coming, but you tend to neglect it. So it is characterized by being obvious. It is visible, coming right at you with large potential impact and high probable consequences. So these are some of the causes. And please remember that in our world today, we are surrounded by gray rhinos. Now, as crisis managers or potential crisis managers, what we should be mindful of is which is that gray rhino which is going to be harmful to your organization, and how do you stop it from hitting you? That's the whole essence of crisis management. Identifying a potential crisis, preparing for it, being ready for the impact, and then being ready to bounce back without getting hurt. So typical cases of gray rhinos: fires in the premises or in the neighborhood, environmental disasters in the making, which could be pollution related or waste disposal related, natural disasters related to floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, cyclones, health and safety issues like pandemics, industrial accidents, workplace accidents, food poisoning, labor relations. These could be strikes or issues related to unfair dismissals, restructuring, relocation, ethnic and social activism in various parts of the country or various parts of the world, whether which leads to ethnic violence or racial riots. We have social political issues at a macro level, which could result in problems for your company operations, whether it's war, whether it's rioting, hijacking, kidnapping, ransom demands. Technology today is one of the biggest potential gray rhino, where every company that has I would say that there are very few companies which have not been attacked by cybercrime or cyber criminals. It's just that some of them couldn't breach you or some of them could breach you. So cybersecurity breaches, IT disruptions, the lack of IT equipment, typical case of IT equipment without going into too many details, a ban on certain Chinese providers for networking equipment, which led to some companies and some countries having to restructure their entire communication equipment basis, which obviously leads to a huge disruption and a huge cost. Reputational crisis, sometimes this could be malicious, sometimes this could be deliberate, sometimes this could be accidental, sometimes this could be caused by insiders who, so whistleblowers who have become malicious. And at the macro level, we also have terrorist attacks. So IEDs, I hope you understand what IEDs are: improvised explosive devices, that is crude bombs, and VBIEDs, which are very, very crudely, you can equate it to say car bombs or truck bombs. And you have active shooters who may be a lone wolf attacker or a group of people who have undertaken shooting. And actually, I would like to put here again health issues and pandemics as one of the top related gray rhinos. Also climate change issues, which now people are realizing are growing more and more. So I'm going to take 4 case studies. I know some of you would have heard of some of them, and at the cost of repetition, I just want to go over a few of them quickly. So have all of you heard about the BP oil spill case? Yes, Bhupendra has said already. Yes, so a lot of people have heard about the Deepwater Horizon spill by BP. So I'm going to quickly summarize some of the issues. So there was a in the Gulf of Mexico, this was a oil well. So ignition of escaping gases led to explosion and fire, and failure of activating the blowout protection and well sealing led to massive growth in this fire and explosions. The rig sank on 22nd April 2010. 4 million barrels of oil spilt into the Gulf, which is currently acknowledged as the biggest environmental disaster in US history. And 11 people lost their lives in this disaster. And more important, that the entire fragile ecosystem of the whole Gulf of Mexico region was greatly affected. And some of the aspects related to crisis management. Like I said, I'm not going to talk about the technical issues. So at the very outset, the CEO of BP downplayed the intensity of the incident. And he used a bad choice of words like the spill, that, oh, it's very relatively tiny. And during testification with the US Congress, he said, I'd like my life back. So this was taken very negatively for the reputation of the company globally. And then, of course, the blame game between Halliburton and BP regarding the integrity of the cement head, that did not help to manage the crisis. And at the end, after the investigation, Halliburton also pleaded guilty to destroying evidence. There was a lack of regulatory oversight by the government with regards to drilling and emergency response in the Gulf of Mexico. There was negligence with regards to time-saving measures on the part of the BP and its partners. And the former VP of exploration made false statements to the law enforcement regarding the rate at which oil was leaking. So because of which they could not cap the spill in time. And only 25% of the total oil spill was recovered. The beaches, the wildlife, and the marine ecosystem was greatly affected due to this spill. So there is a video which relates to this, how a spoof on that, which I'm not going to show you now, but because we may run out of time. But if you want, just Google it or just check on YouTube for a video called BP oil spill spoof, and you'll like to see something interesting there. Now, this is actually the largest industrial disaster or crisis in the world, which happened in India, in Bhopal. So this was a manufacturing plant where flowback of water into methyl isocyanate tanks caused an uncontrollable exothermic reaction. An MIC gas was emitted out of the Union Carbide industry, pesticide factory. Gas cloud drifted towards the city and eventually killed more than 15,000 people. And as a result, 500,000 people have suffered respiratory problems, blindness, and DNA mutations. 7,000 animals died. And Union Carbide, as you're aware, is a huge global multinational. And the legal battle continues. And you know how things are in such situations. The legal problems are not going to get sorted out fast, and especially for the victims who cannot afford expensive litigation. Some of the aspects of crisis management that the workers should have been trained to deal with such scenarios. There should have been a fixed leadership to execute emergency countermeasures. So what happened is that the global management washed their hands of it and said, let the Indian management deal with it. And the Indian management said that, you never empowered us adequately to deal with this. We have no countermeasures. We have no means of containing this. And there was an emergency action plan which was not implemented in time because there was a lot of delay in communicating between the leadership levels. Now, what was strange is that the local public should have been made aware of the presence of such hazardous chemicals and gases being stored and produced in their vicinity, which was never told to them. Had that been known, there would have been probably some sort of measures being taken by the community or the government. During the disaster, the hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors had no knowledge for the treatment in this case because this was not a gas which was being dealt with commercially, and this also hindered patient treatment. And the Union Carbide Corporation CEO Warren Anderson was released from custody. He fled to USA. He was never arrested. And 7 Indian workers who were guilty of negligence were subjected to some small prison sentences and were soon released on bail. So overall, yes, who suffered the most? The victims, and also the reputation of the company. And in the middle of all of these legal battles in 2001, Dow Chemical Company just took over the whole UCC and they washed their hands of any responsibility. And they said, this is not our problem. This was the problem of Union Carbide. The next case study, which I'll talk about, is the Odisha government's preparedness for Cyclone Fani in 2019. So Odisha is a state in India, which is on the eastern seaboard. It happens to lie in the Bay of Bengal, which is a part of the Indian Ocean. And due to various environmental phenomena, it undergoes cyclones every year. But this is usually in the current season, the months of August, September, etc., and later towards October. But in 2019, on 3rd May, there was a very rare summer cyclone which hit Odisha. And although it was being tracked by the meteorological department, it was one of the strongest cyclones in 20 years. And there were wind speeds of up to 125 mph, which were predicted. And surprisingly, despite such a hugely devastating cyclone, such a massive, powerful cyclone, the overall extent of life was only minimized to 64 people due to the preparedness of the government. So here now I'm going to talk about some good aspects of crisis management, how a little bit of foresight, little bit of preparation, little bit of good planning led to management of a crisis to minimize its impact. So what did they do? So they had very good predictions by the Indian Meteorological Department to accurately determine the cyclone landfall, and they accurately tracked its path. What was really amazing was that under 48 hours, 1.2 million people were evacuated from the landfall zone. Since 1991, 900 cyclone shelters were built because obviously, like I mentioned, that state is prone to getting cyclones during the rainy season. So they had already catered for adequate cyclone shelters. And 7,000 kitchens catering to 9,000 shelters were made fully functional. The government implemented a very good command and control structure to lead the rescue efforts. And this included the police, the fire departments, the National Disaster Relief Forces, the Army, the Navy and Air Force. So various agencies were taken into this command structure. And local communities also formed coordination groups to help authorities in their rescue efforts. And what is really amazing, again, that 45,000 people volunteered in the rescue and relief operations, including people from the NDRF and other individual groups as well. Good lessons for crisis management. The government had already taken physical measures to handle problems of cyclones. Shelters ensured that people were safe and isolated from the cyclone. A fixed leadership structure was there to make sure that all the rescue efforts were well coordinated and there were no slippages due to lack of communication. There was a very clear communication plan between the authorities and members of the public. 2.6 million text messages had been sent to the people to warn them of the cyclone. And what was really amazing that at this time, the government had ordered or coordinated between the various mobile service providers to have mobile towers set up at various places. And at this time, for that period of 5 or 6 days, they had sort of waived off sharing each other's bandwidth and said that all calls will go through, all messages will go through. We don't care who uses whose towers, we don't care who uses which bandwidth, and nobody is paying for any of it. We will pay for all of it. And the early warnings from the IMD, of course, gave the locals a fighting chance to move to safer areas. And the local group contributions really helped the authorities in their endeavors. And this preparedness of the government and its very zero casualty policy has been touted as a very good example of disaster management, especially natural disasters. The last case study which I'll talk about, all of you would be familiar with this. This was in July 2018, where a group of boys was stuck in Thailand in the Tham Luang caves. 12 boys of a soccer team, and their coach went missing after they went for an exploratory visit into a cave system. And heavy rainfall partially flooded the cave system, blocking their way out and trapping them deep within that. And then 2 British drivers found the group alive on an elevated rock, about 1.6 miles from the cave mouth, which was pretty deep inside. And between 8th and 10th July, all the 12 boys and their coach were rescued from the cave by an international team. Those of you who there is a very interesting movie made on this called 13 Lives. So I will urge all of you to please, I think it's available on Netflix. I'm not sure, but you must definitely watch this movie to see how the whole operation took place, how the whole rescue operation took place. 13 Lives. It's on Amazon. Okay, thanks, Rajesh. Yeah, I wasn't sure whether it was on Amazon or Netflix. A 37-year-old Thai Navy SEAL died, of course, and there were some other issues. Some other people suffered some injuries and all that. But all in all, it was an excellent example of crisis management. And why? Because leadership. So there was an assistant coach with the boys who could really calm the boys down, young boys, anxiety levels high. He taught them meditation. He taught them mind calming exercises. He taught them conversations. He taught them how to rest. And there was no food, there was no assurance, there was no hope, but he managed to keep their morale and motivation high all through that period of 12 to 13 days. Responsibility. Now, yes, the Thai armed forces, the Navy SEALs, they all had made attempts, but what was really amazing is that international cave divers who were not formally invited by the Thai government, they landed up from all parts of the world who wanted to contribute their expertise, and ultimately it was due to their expertise that these boys were found and these boys were rescued, because they had the specialized equipment, they had the specialized knowledge and the specialized experience to deal with this. Also, pumps were set up to extract water from the cave chambers. Cave divers came with specialist equipment, like I said, from Australia, US, and also from the UK. And sniffer dogs and drones were also used to scan for other cave openings. They did not find any, so ultimately they were extricated from the same place. And like I said, they had put in pumps. Then a logistics camp was established at the cave entrance, which accommodated all the volunteers and journalists in addition to the rescue workers. The residents of the local area, they volunteered to cook and clean for all the supporting staff, the families of the missing team people who had come to the area. And the government also of Thailand acted really fast, and they approved the diving rescue plan immediately. They said, okay, whatever resources anybody wants are at your disposal. Now, in a crisis, you also have to sometimes resort to extreme measures. And here what they did was that they partially sedated the boys to avoid anxiety, and also to help them not panic during the rescue. And then they were extracted in small groups. And what was also good is that after the extraction, there were precautionary hospitalization, health checks to see that there was no post-traumatic stress disorders amongst the boys, amongst the rescuers, and things like that. So this is again touted as a brilliant example of crisis management and rescue effort. So these were some of the case studies which I thought I'd discuss with you, negatives, positive, and just to give you a quick rundown on various potential triggers for crisis in the coming years, in the coming year. So weaponization of energy and food, we've already seen some of that due to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Supply chains, I have talked about, and that's not the end of the story. It's going to continue because of disruptions in various supply chains, whether it's of food, whether it's of fuel, whether it's fertilizers. So you must have heard of the story of how the switching over to organic fertilizer, the policy decision taken by the Sri Lankan government actually resulted in the non-organic fertilizer not being allowed to unload in Sri Lanka ports. The effect of that was felt months later when the organic fertilizer was not sufficient to sustain the food productivity in the country. And currently, one of the contributors to the economic crisis in Sri Lanka is the lack of homegrown food. Cybersecurity, I think it's not worth spending time during this discussion because that merits a completely dedicated time frame to talk about issues related to cybersecurity and crisis. Inflation, the taxation, audits and sanctions. I think again, we are seeing some of these issues where you have green taxes, you have sanctions against countries which are not politically matching up with your ideology or are indulging in let's say harmful activities towards other countries. And the effects of the pandemic and the rising business costs are not yet over. So, and it's not going to go away soon. So governments are coming to grips with the lack, and especially those governments which were, or those countries which were highly dependent on industries like tourism, hospitality. These are the countries, or travel, these are the countries which were seriously affected. And this will continue to have an issue on their or aspect bearing on their economic growth. And allegations of misconduct. So this is again something which I thought I'll bring up because you saw how Black Lives Matter came into the media limelight. Then let's say handling of differently abled people, handling of different genders, allegations of how companies are discriminating against certain kinds of ethnicities or certain kinds of sexual proclivities or genders. This is something which is going to keep coming up in the media and can lead to a huge public relations disaster for certain companies. So these are just some of the potential crisis triggers which I've identified. Now, what we need to do is that crisis management, we need to sort of create a structure. And I've already mentioned this initially, where we need to start with prevention, then mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. I think these are self-explanatory words. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to dilate a lot on this because all organizations in some manner or the other have this structure in place. Now, if you don't have some of these things in place, as crisis managers or potential members of your organization's crisis management team, you need to put in place that structure, whether it's a prevention mechanism, whether it's a mitigation mechanism, whether it's a preparedness. Yes, I have seen somebody raising the hand, but I think what we'll do is we'll wait to the end for the questions, as was indicated to us initially. And how do you make a crisis management plan? This is important. So first is, you, like I said, that's why I showed you that image of the laptop with a cup of coffee spilt on it. You have to assess your risks, What are your risks? Is that laptop critical to you? If it is not, it's just an incident. You can replace it with another laptop. But was that laptop being used to bring out a key business plan at a certain juncture where you required that? Then and did you not have backup? Then it could have been a disaster. So you need to identify which are risks, assess the impact of those risks on your organization, then identify contingencies. Okay, if this happens, then what do I do? If this happens, then what should we do? If this happens, what should we do? Then you build a plan. So, in the military, we say that there are two things which we say at least in the military that I served in. One is that you make plan A, you make plan B, you make plan C, you make plan D. And what happens is something related to plan E, which you never worked on. You always thought that I need to work out a plan E, but you didn't. And the second thing is, which you would have heard, it's more common, that no war plan survives the first bullet. So what happens is that you may make whatever great contingency plans, but when the first bullet is fired, there will be a huge change in your plans. Does that mean we don't make plans? Of course not. You need to make plans so that you identify what are your shortcomings organizationally to deal with the outcomes or the impacts of this crisis. Now, it's not just enough to make a plan. You have to sensitize everyone. You have to make everyone who is part of that plan aware that organizationally, we do have a crisis management plan in place. This is how it will work out in case we have, let's say, for example, okay, you are in an office. Just giving you a very small example. Let's say you occupy a huge office building, which is likely to be affected by floods during the rains. So everyone in that office building must be aware that in case the water levels rise to a certain level, we are going to make an announcement. We are going to send you messages. We are going to send you emails. If you are not yet come to the office, we may ask you to stay back home. Then if you are stuck, we'll make announcements that this is the time the buses are leaving, or or a special transport has been arranged for you to get you home. And then last is that once you made your plans, you need to revise and revisit them every time something comes up. So this is how you make a plan. And some of the best practices is, like I said, have a crisis team. So an example of a good crisis team should be not just a fixed structure of the organization. When required, bring in experts. So for example, what happened when Volkswagen had that issue about pollution, their vehicles hiding pollution issues, then they brought in some experts to say, yes, this is the exam, this is what happened. And then they said, yes, we made a mistake. So the crisis team was able to give scientific examples to show that, yes, this was the story and we did make a mistake, and now we are going back on that. So of course, have a plan, be present. Now, a crisis manager or somebody who's part of a crisis management team cannot actually control or mitigate or manage a crisis from far away. Example in the recent past was when Australia had a large number of forest fires. There were, the Prime Minister was away and holidaying in Hawaii, and his staff was not willing to reveal his destination or his location. And then it was out in the social media that there were some pictures circulated of him being on vacation in Hawaii. And well, obviously, as a office bearer or as a national leader, when there's a huge crisis happening in your country, you cannot be away, or at least you should show concern and come onto the stage and say that, okay, look, okay, Andy says that's not unusual for any Australian Prime Minister. I will not comment on that. I'm talking more from the crisis management perspective, that if you're a leader, if you're in the leadership team, when there's a crisis happening, you should have your boots on the ground. Speak the truth. So something again, which a lot of this is a case in point was Amazon, where they said that, oh, we are looking after our employees, and the employee unions came back to say that, look, these are the malpractices against us. Communicate clearly. So typical example of communication was where and the right spokesperson, where during the pandemic, the US actually brought in Anthony Fauci to talk about various aspects of crisis of the pandemic, because he had a technical background. He could explain things the way that there was a lot of backlash against what he was saying, and there were a lot of disbelievers. But to the majority of the public, he was the right spokesman. He was responding quickly to the situation, and he was communicating clearly. So another thing is that you need to have good intel, and you need to monitor critical events. So I talked about those triggers, but just to revise, from the intel perspective, you need to say, what is a crisis for you? Identify that potential crisis, identify organizational vulnerabilities. So everything is not a crisis for you. And what are your vulnerabilities? Whether it's a IT breakdown, whether it's a power shortage, whether it's a physical damage to some part of your operations, then you need to scan the environment and internal environment, external and internal, for any indicators, any trends, which will tell you. This is where we say that we need to work on having a gray rhino lookout. And once you have a gray rhino lookout, then you pick up these events, you analyze, identify, and prepare your organization for these. The social media maelstrom, I think everyone knows, confuses and overloads you with information, creates biases and prejudices, diverts attention from the main issue. And today what happens is that it appeals to religion, caste, and nationalism. So, there's a saying, at what speed does a pandemic travel? So they said a pandemic travels at the speed of a jet engine, because in a globalized world, people during the COVID-19 pandemic, people flying in from one part of the world where there was infection, moving to another part of the world where hitherto there was no infection, was spreading the infection in those new geographies. So pandemic traveled at the speed of a jet aircraft, and fake news travels at the speed of light, because that's the speed of electronic transmission. So fake news actually travels at the speed of light. Crisis communication is something really important. We need to understand what's happening, and simple way of finding out is 6 W's. When is it happening? Why is it happening? Where is it happening? Who does it affect? What is the effect? And to whom does it matter? And then you can build your responses, you can build your mitigation strategies around us, because you need to know how it affects us, and then your whole organization needs to do what we are doing about it. So here it's very important to have language and communication skills, especially in multinational organizations where you're dealing with different countries, where you're talking about somebody in some other country, but people are not able to understand you. Use multiple means of communication, whether it's, for example, during the tsunami rescue in Japan, as well as in India and Myanmar, people were using ham radio in addition to satellite phones and the internet to talk to each other, and follow laid down SOPs, that is the standing operating procedures. I'm just going to show you a quick video about communication. I'm sure some of you would have seen it, but those of you
chasing
who
that
have
A
not,
and want to save time? Grammarly makes editing one click simple.
Screen.
We can help make complex rewrites and nuanced word choices quick and easy. Like, really easy. 74% of students say that Grammarly saves them over 1 hour.
Okay, are you able to see this
Das
video?
hier ist mein Sektor. Das
Yeah,
hier
we
ist
can see that now.
das Überlebens. Mayday, Mayday. Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us? Can you? Over. We are sinking. We are sinking.
Hello? This is the German Coast Guard.
We are sinking. We're sinking.
What are you thinking about?
Okay, I'm sure a lot of you have seen this in the past. So for those guys, I apologize for the repetition, but there may be some of you. Can you see my screen now again?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, great. So could you all of you watch the video with the sound and the audio and the video?
Yeah, I could. Yes.
Okay, great. So the last part about crisis is I'm going to talk about is crisis simulation exercises, because most strategic decision makers don't have too much practical or real life experience of such events. And simulation actually provides an opportunity to them to explore the organization structure and examine the system under stress. Also, decision makers at the strategic level can understand how to respond to the various challenges of a crisis. It provides both the opportunity to learn from positive experiences as well as from negative experiences. And it also helps to identify key individuals with the appropriate skills who can add value to your crisis management team. And it also helps you to identify individuals or groups with key skills or deficiencies. The deficiency part is also important. The key skills part is also very important. So you can have crisis simulation exercise on various scenarios or a combination of scenarios where you can make it complex and hybrid. These can be tabletop exercises that can be actual simulations in certain situations, whether you talk of pandemic or terrorist attack, insider threats, protest, urban flooding, cyber attacks, or environmental disasters. So many things that lead to a crisis can be simulated either on a desktop manner. The whole aim is to exercise the structure of the crisis management team as well as its decision-making capability, and not to forget its communication plans. So I'm not sure how much time I have overrun, JC, and Andy, but I think I'm well within limits to say that some of the key takeaways of what I spoke today, that good crisis and disaster management can help to save lives, protect premises, assets, and reputations. It's also important to understand the external environment and have good intelligence to identify a potential crisis. Crisis communication is one of the major keys to effective crisis management, in my experience also. And practices, drills, and simulations can help us to be better prepared. So with that, I have come to what I had to say as part of my monologue. And now I would request questions. Anyone, any questions, observations, comments, whatever?
So thanks for that, Shashil. So just before we get to the questions, it's quite interesting that obviously as safety professionals and risk professionals, we have to deal with situations and events on a daily and weekly and monthly basis. Where do you think the biggest gaps are from our profession transitioning across the crisis management, and how do we get better to facilitate more positive outcomes in those situations?
That's a very good question, tough question, and no easy answers there. But I have, from my experience of helping some organizations to manage their crisis, some of the things which I can pull up off the top of my head is, firstly, is the ostrich head in the sand syndrome, where everyone at the leadership level usually thinks that, oh, this can't happen to us, and they are unwilling to acknowledge that there's a storm coming their way. So they just bury their head in the sand and say, it'll pass, but it doesn't pass. It could hurt you. So the first step is to raise awareness levels within the organization to say that, let's look out for what can go wrong. That brings me to the second part, that there are of course, but a lot of time people don't have adequate attention being paid to the signs of something going wrong. So risk identification, good intel capabilities are important. And then also you need to have good internal communications to make sure that the people who are identifying the risks are communicating it to the decision makers, and then the decision makers are communicating it down to the business heads or the other stakeholders. And then those other stakeholders are saying, okay, thanks for the information. As an organization, now I will gear up my business practice or my part of the region or my manufacturing plant or my supply chain to deal with this. So intelligence, awareness, communications. Again, this is somewhere in a lot of organizations, it's there, but it is not geared up towards crisis preparedness, because you're always looking at these aspects from business, growth, targets. But what about the negatives? So this is my experience. And the third part is that is the command and control structure for crisis management team. You will be surprised that some of the organizations that we interacted with don't even have a formal crisis management team. So there's no perfect crisis management team, but there are certain people who are always going to be part of it. For example, the corporate communications or the public relations head, because he or she is the person who's going to speak to the media. Then you need to have somebody in the logistics part, because if there's something to be done, they are the people who are going to coordinate the transport, the accommodation, the victualling, the supplies, the emergency medical preparedness. So at least the basic structure of a crisis management team must be there. And then, like I said, create some ad hoc expertise by bringing in for that particular crisis. If somebody important is required, bring him or her as part of the member of that team. So these are some of the gaps which I see across the board in many organizations from the perspective of managing crises.
Thank you, Shashil. JC, I will throw to you, sir. Do we have any questions, or is there anyone on the call that has a question for Shashil?
Hi, Sushil. This is Balian here from Singapore. It's a great presentation and sharing of your knowledge. I deeply appreciate your sharing with us. Fabulous. My question is that can we say that crisis management is same as an emergency situations and the management?
To some extent, yes. So again, again, I've not got into the theory of it, but we talked about two methods of a crisis, or of a oncoming crisis. One is a black swan event, which you really haven't thought about, and the second is a gray rhino. So a emergency technically is also a gray rhino. You have, say for example, you have, I'm just giving an example. I don't know which industry you come from, but let's say if you're in a manufacturing industry and you have a regular power shutdown, every week there's a power shutdown or a breakdown of some systems. So these are localized emergencies. They last for a few hours. But as a crisis manager, you should be saying that, look, why is this happening with so much regularity? And should we be prepared mentally for a bigger crisis where this breakdown can be much bigger and can last for many days, which will result in a complete downtime as far as the manufacturing plant is concerned. So emergency management takes care of an incident or an event for a short duration, and then it's over and dealt with. But a crisis could be a multiplicative level of an emergency. I hope I've been able to make some sense there.
Yes, this question arises because usually we don't use crisis management. We
Right.
use emergency management. I never seen in my 26 years of HSE profession, I have used this crisis management basically. So
let me throw that question back to you from the point of view of the current pandemic. So for your organization, was that an emergency or was it a crisis then?
Actually, in the beginning, it is an emergency, but later on, it becomes a crisis.
Exactly my point. Exactly my point. Thanks. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Yeah.
We do have a question from the chat. So from Claire Warman, I believe it is. We put together, we're putting together our on-call minimum requirements for each of our sites. We're an international business. What do you think are the minimum requirements that we should specify? We split our response into operational, tactical, and strategic.
Okay, that's a very good question. And this is a question which you need to ask back to your organization. Like I said, contextualize what constitutes a crisis for your organization. You need to identify, is a minor thing like a power breakdown a crisis for you? If it's not, and you already dealt with it, no worries. So at the operational level, at the tactical level, that is not a concern. So you need to say, okay, our crisis, this is actually what companies do is, or what multiple multinational organizations do is, they have a very macro level crisis management policy. To say, for example, I've read a half-page policy document, crisis management policy document, which says no loss of life of our employees or our partners is acceptable. Work can stop, but lives must not be lost. And third is, if anyone is in danger, they need not come to work, they can stay at home. So this is a very, I would say, a very human aware organization. Everyone may not function like that. Everyone may have different business imperatives. So at a macro level, you need to set the tone. You need to say, what is our organizational policy for dealing with crisis? What is our organizational culture, which will lead to handling of a crisis? And then you translate it down at the strategic and operational level in various countries and call it what we call a playbook. So you have a crisis management playbook. So you have various scenarios being played out. For example, if you were to set up operations in India in a flood prone or a monsoon prone area, so your playbook would constitute of cyclone preparedness, the rainfall preparedness, flood preparedness. If you are in another scenario where you are more concerned about disruptions of transport and supply chain due to let's say any reason, then your playbook would constitute of what happens if there is a railway strike, what happens if there's a trucking strike, what happens if there's a cab strike. Again, a playbook for another geography where there's a lot of political upheaval or a lot of I would say protests or mobs or riots happening. Your playbook would constitute of in case of riots, in case of violence on the streets, in case of protests, how would I protect my system? How would I make sure that the critical people reach the plant or the offices? So playbooks have to be created, but all the playbooks must flow out of a central policy at a macro level for multinational organizations, but regional playbooks must take into consideration local issues and how to deal with those local issues. I hope I've been able to put that across.
It's a great answer. Thank you, Shishil. Another question that's came through. Business continuity plans, should they form part of the crisis control?
That's another good question. And usually what happens is that in today's organizations, crisis management is usually dealt with either by the safety and health departments, or the security departments, or the business continuity department, depending on what kind of organization it is. For example, if it is a software company, occupational health and safety or security is not so critical as far as, a crisis may be very minor for them. Whereas from the business continuity perspective, planning of IT disaster or a IT breakdown or a power breakdown or a software issue or a cyber attack, this would be forming more, this would come more under the remit of the business continuity team. But for a manufacturing plant, the occupational health and safety aspect may be more important. Or let's say for a bank or for a vault which holds bullion or cash, the security department would be the most important from the management of a crisis perspective. So it depends on the nature of your organization. So going back again to that little pencil I showed you, contextualize what is a crisis for you, and then the appropriate team must deal with it. So yes, business continuity teams in many organizations are the key component of the crisis management team and will remain so.
So there's been a question, you've sort of answered it there, but I'm going to try and put you on the spot, Shishil, now. Who really should be in that crisis management team? Because I think we've all seen it where everyone tries to put their hands in just to try and help, and it tends to make it worse. Sometimes you get a number of executives who think they're doing the right thing and they end up running off. So can you give us what would be your dream team of maybe 4 or 5 key people that should be involved in that crisis management team?
Okay, and that is also leading to another question which I just read on the chat box, that who should lead this crisis management team? So I'll try and take on both questions in the same answer. So if you were to ask me who should be part of the crisis management team, first is the business heads, because they are responsible for identifying how this crisis is going to hit the organization, whether it's from the perspective of the actual business or the perspective of people safety or the perspective of asset safety. So the business heads must definitely be part of it. The second, so they are actually the people who are responsible for it, the CEO, the COO, and the business heads, and to a large extent the CFO, because the financial outcomes of the business would be really important. So they would be there, and their advisors, if I may say so, would be the safety heads, the security heads, the IT head, the business continuity head. Their support system would be the people handling the admin, the transport, the hands-on security, let's say the infrastructure in terms of electricity, water, and other utilities or supplies. A very, very key part of any crisis management team is the guy who, or the people or the team or the person who is going to communicate this to the outside world as well as to the inside world. When I say the inside world, it is down the chain into the organization to make sure that there is no panic in a crisis. And when I say outside, it is to the stakeholders, the shareholders, the board of the company, the media, social media. So the communications team, whether it's public relations, internal, external. So this in a nutshell would be the dream crisis management team, to my understanding.
Is there anyone that shouldn't be in the crisis management team?
as long as they shut up when they are there, when they are not required to be, I don't see any reason for excluding anyone. And also, sorry, I forgot to answer that question as to who should lead it. Well, it depends on the nature of the crisis. Like I said, if it's related to health and safety, then obviously, so the leader is always the C-suite. Always, the leadership is always with the C-suite. It is who should be the principal advisor in that crisis situation that is important.
Well, Shashil, we've run over quite a bit of time. However, it's been a fantastic presentation. It's been really insightful. It's been extremely well received on the chat. What I'd like to do is, on behalf of the Singapore branch EXCO team, thank you for volunteering your time and coming up today and talking to us and being so engaging and getting everyone involved. Really appreciate the time and effort that you've put in. And again, thank you very much. For everyone else that's been on the session today, really appreciate the fact that you've dialed in. It's been a fantastic session again. Really, we'd like to get your feedback on these type of sessions. So there will be a short questionnaire that will come out as soon as this session's done. And as always, please connect to anyone in the EXCO team. Reach out to us. We're always here to help. If you've got any suggestions on presenters or anything that you'd like to touch on, for us to touch on as a team to support you guys, please let us know. Shashil, it's been an absolute pleasure. To everyone else, and Shashil, stay safe, have a great evening, day, or rest of the morning. Look after yourself, and we'll speak soon.